5 to midnight. Sunday evening, your sound session on Rainier Avenue Radio. You can protect others from getting sick from COVID-19. Here's what you do. Stay at home unless you need food, medicine, or medical care. Avoid large crowds, and if you have to go out, stay at least 6 feet away from other people. Don't forget to wear a cloth face covering so you don't spread germs when you talk, sneeze, or cough. Cloth coverings should not, however, be used on children under 2. For more information, call 206-477-3977. That's 206-477-3977.
This is the news on Rainier Avenue Radio.
In the latest row over protest symbols in the workplace, employees at Seattle area QFC and Fred Meyer stores say that a ban on quote-unquote Black Lives Matter buttons violates federal labor law and their union contract. Quote, I think they're afraid they'll lose money by offending some customers, unquote, Motoko Kusanagi told the Seattle Times, who works at the University Village QFC, where she says the store's director has been, quote, pulling people aside individually and asking them to take the pin off, unquote. On Tuesday, United Food and Commercial Workers Local 21,
the Beijing Bering Sea region. He was part of a reporting team at the Anchorage Daily News that received the Pulitzer Prize for Public Service for reporting on Alaska's native peoples, and a team at the Seattle Times that received the Pulitzer Prize for breaking news for reporting on a landslide that killed 43 people. So congratulations on your work, Hal.
Well, thank you. I've been sticking a lot closer to Portland this summer with a lot of the events that have been happening, and I'm based out of Portland. They've actually let me be based out of here for the full 20 years that I've worked for the Seattle Times.
Well, I'm going to get right to it. Hal, you know what I'm going to talk about. Just had a conversation with the FBI Seattle chapters. From my perspective, the heightened awareness of the potential for violence and clashes as the President of the United States refused to clearly denounce white supremacy. And this was taken, if you're looking at social media, as a positive for right-wing hate groups. Let's start with you and what you've been covering in Portland in particular, and when you've been in Seattle. What can you tell us about the protests? From your perspective as a reporter, as a journalist, is it just people coming out of their homes, protesting, and then getting angry? And is it groups from other areas who are coming in? And where does the violence come into play?
We certainly had a mix of protests in Portland, just as there have been in Seattle since May. A lot of the earlier protests were larger, involving many thousands of people. I think we all remember some of the memorable pictures of everybody taking a knee on the bridges, one of the bridges over while they were crossing over Portland in memory of George Floyd. From early on, there have been some acts of arson and window smashing and other things that have unfolded and continued. And we've had some also in some of the protests more recently, some Molotov cocktails thrown and such. And those are basically protests that have featured folks who have been marching on the racial injustice issue, and they've been going up with the police, or in July in something that really drew the attention of the nation and to a certain extent the world, when Trump brought more federal law enforcement agents into Portland. There was just a huge amount of tear gas every night and a lot of things. In August, we've seen some different types of things happening with events that have drawn either Trump supporters or right-wing groups such as the Proud Boys or Patriot Prayer. and others groups, other militia groups. There have also been some of them. And in a couple of occasions in August, there were some pretty free-for-all brawls between these folks and then the protesters for racial injustice. And on one of these protests, August 29th,
I'm sorry, Hal, between which folks and the protesters for racial injustice?
Yeah. There was a Trump rally August 29th. It was large. It was over 1,000 people, and it was on the outskirts outside of Portland in Clackamas County. And a significant number of this caravan of Trump supporters decided to take a detour through Portland as part of their caravan. And at that point, some of them were very well armed with mace and other paint gun balls and such. And some of the protesters who came to meet them had mace as well, or rocks and such. And there was a lot of, and there were just some fisticuffs. So things were pretty wild. I was down there. And then afterwards, one supporter of Patriot Prayer, which is a right-wing group that's really based more in the Vancouver area, he was killed by a gunshot wound that penetrated his chest. And that was quite a moment.
My guest again is Hal Bernton, staff reporter for the Seattle Times, but based out of Portland. We're talking about domestic terrorism, and from let's go back to this. Have you seen, and I'm not trying to drag you into the political discussion here, but it's kind of unavoidable. And again, with the general public saying, okay, how do we get our information? Where do we get our information from? And one of the sources you would look to would be the federal government. What we're hearing from the federal government is this what they're calling left wing, and in particular, Antifa. What do you know about, and who are these groups, these left wing groups, according to the president and the federal government, that are committing violence, and what type of violence are they committing?
Well, the actions, it is true that there's no group that says we're Antifa and we have membership and here's how you tattoo that on your arm. Not that I know of, and I don't think that that's something that exists in that fashion. Like the the Proud Boys actually have a membership initiation, and as part of that initiation, there's a tattoo and all that sort of stuff. Obviously, there are different groups that have loosely organized the protests in Portland, and some of them are pretty upfront about being anarchist groups. They really have problems with the capitalist system and as it exists today, and really are all about systemic change. On their websites and such, they'll say that, hey, it wasn't just Martin Luther King and all the nonviolent protests that triggered change in the 60s. There was also the riots. And a lot of people are saying, when you're out there, don't police how I protest. That said, I've seen a lot of conflict about what are the appropriate tactics for people to take. As some have tried to light arson fires, I've seen others step in to try to say, no, that's not helping, and set them out. And that's been something I've seen quite a bit, where there's been discussion and concern over what tactic is used, even as some say it's not PC, it's not correct to sort of choose the tactic or to try to be a police over the tactics. Arson is one of the things that's happened. There have been fires set. One black conservative journalist was stabbed in an incident. So there have been a variety of things on the left. And then, of course, there was these overall scuffles where the Proud Boys and others have been involved in a lot of mace spraying, fisticuffs, and things like this.
And so then you've kind of mentioned it, but what have you seen, and can you identify? And it's interesting. You talk about some groups who have membership or identifiable markings that make them part of it, and you mentioned Antifa as not having any centralized, or real, leadership or organized, strategy. On the right side, is part of this domestic terrorism issue. What have you seen? Who have you seen? And has there been violence committed? And who has that violence been committed against?
Well, I think that we should look at the fact that the right is also not a monolith, and there are different groups and tensions within those groups, or about what are the appropriate tactics. The things that I personally have witnessed have been pretty much open brawling where both sides are going at it. Those are the things I personally have witnessed. I've reported on other types of incidences, such as an incident several years back where a man was on the street and he basically gave the finger to a couple Proud Boys or told them off, and then he was beaten. And there were some charges filed on that case. There are other cases of aggravated assault that I've reported on, of assault from New York City, where in the aftermath, where two Proud Boys were convicted in court for assault on Antifa protesters. So there are incidences like that. There's also an ongoing case where one of the Proud Boys was seriously injured in a hit-and-run attack in a parking lot earlier in September in Vancouver, Washington, by a man that they allege was an active participant in the protests. I've talked with his attorney, and he says, yeah, he's Black Lives Matter supporter, but so are millions of other people, and didn't ascribe to him said he had no real knowledge of his exact political affiliations or what his involvement was in the protest. But that was an incident that certainly put the Proud Boys on edge. They mentioned it actually at a Trump rally that some of their members attended on Labor Day.
Have you seen violence that was instigated by members who identify themselves or folks who identify themselves as active members or participants in the Black Lives Matter movement?
I have not seen anything personally except against property, you might say. I've seen a police precinct, a police association building where there was a lot of effort to break through the plywood and then set a fire inside it. Those are the kinds of things that I've seen. I've seen other arson fires set that were more minor. They were in streets and such, but I'm not out there all the time. I don't claim to be witnessing, a witness to everything that goes on.
How much of this, from your perspective, Hal, is still about, from what you've seen, from what you've reported on, from what you've investigated, is still about George Floyd, or has it completely turned into something else? And we'll start with that. From your perspective, what do you see out there in regards to what's taking place now? Well,
there are, of course, people of color who are involved in the protests, but they're not in the majority in a lot of the protests that I've seen. Often they're taking leadership roles, but there's lots of other folks who are very concerned in the Portland community. They're not involved in the protests, but they're very concerned about an upsurge in violence in the Black community. Like in July, the highest number of murders in 30 years. Concerns that some of the efforts to defund the police might take away from some of the efforts that they felt were actually helping diffuse some of the gang violence. So, and they weren't against reforming or changing or defunding some of the police, but they wanted a plan in place, and they felt that that wasn't put in place before some of the changes were made. And now I think we're all concerned about really what lies ahead in this next 4-week period. If Trump declares in his mind that somehow the election was illegitimate, I expect lots of people might feel compelled to take to the streets. People from the left might feel like he's trying to steal the election, and others might feel that he's called them to action. So this whole period in the aftermath of the election is one that I think is raising a lot of concern, particularly in our region, because the right wing, a lot of folks on the right have used what's happened in Seattle and Portland and the activism there as sort of recruiting tool in other parts of the Northwest to sort of expand their membership.
Where would you, as a journalist, place on the landscape of civil unrest what's going on right now? Would you compare this to the 60s, to, again, some of the stuff that was happening in the turn of the century? Where do you place this as you're covering it and writing it? Is this a paradigm shift? Is this a seminal moment? How do you feel about that in this place in history? Where do you see this being?
Well, there's a lot going on. I was barely a teenager in the 60s, and of course the Vietnam War was driving so much of it, and there were huge protests and lots of stuff going on. I don't know exactly how to compare this, but it seems like this is the most sustained period of action since then. And, I've been really impressed by how much frustration and anger there is out there that's expressed itself through the streets, and concerned about the real potential for more violence, like we saw in that brief moment where the Patriot Paris supporter met with the suspect who was later the suspect in that killing, who was actually, as we know, he was later taken out by law enforcement in Lacey, Washington. I'm concerned that there could be more of those types of encounters, and I think a lot of other folks are as well. Hopefully there won't be, but the door's open there. I mean, the door's been open. We've seen that has happened now.
You're listening to Rainier Avenue Radio. It's me, your host, Tony B. My guest is Hal Bernton, staff reporter for the Seattle Times, but essentially based out of Portland. And we're talking about the potential for violence, domestic terrorism, what he has seen, what he has covered, and kind of now I want to get into moving forward. What makes you go out to say, I'm going to cover this, or something has happened? How do you make the decision, this is what I'm going to cover, how I'm going to cover it, or do you just be there and be a fly on the wall?
Well, sometimes I get pulled in different directions. We've had the fires, which were, a huge events in both Oregon and Washington. And I've done, as you know from my bio, a lot of coverage over the years on environmental issues. And so I've made a few forays out into the countryside to look at the aftermath of the fires. And of course, there, the two worlds sort of collided because there were all these signs, you loot, we shoot. And I was approached at one point, like by folks at a lumber mill, were very suspicious of who I was, because there's been so much misinformation about somehow, protesters were starting fires in Portland, so they must have gone out into the countryside and started these fires. There was actually a fake Twitter account out of New York that one of my colleagues tracked down that basically tweeted out that the fires had been started because we wanted to show people the links between, show the links with climate change, to draw attention to climate change. It was a totally phony account that tweeted that out, but those types of things certainly took on a life of their own. There have been many stories about how those types of things have circulated, and so you felt that extra layer of uneasiness among people in the aftermath of the fire. In reality, a lot of the fires, not all by any means, but quite a few of the more significant ones were started by power lines, which is less perhaps sexy to some folks who are looking for Antifa. But in terms of how I choose what to cover, sometimes events just dictate it, like when all of a sudden the Proud Boys came up square in the debate, when President Trump asked that someone name a white supremacist group for him to denounce, and Joe Biden threw out the Proud Boys name, and then Trump made his standby comment. Suddenly, obviously my editors wanted to have another story on Proud Boys. I should add that the Proud Boys, they do have people of color in their group. They've had ties, folks who have been involved, though, with the infamous Charlottesville march. They have at times attracted white supremacists, and yet at the same time they say we're not racist and we do accept people of color. So they've been they've been fairly persistent about trying to get that message out. Yet there they were. Certainly, they've been widely cited as an example of an extremist group over this past week.
Now, you mentioned to me that the Proud Boys aren't necessarily the ones that when it's coming to right-wing hate groups that need to be worried about. Now,
well, I would say that there are other groups that there have been some chat room transcripts that have been released over the last few weeks by someone who was managed to get inside a chat room, I guess posing as one of these folks, a patriot group out of Oregon. And clearly they are very much talking about how to combat what they consider Antifa. They seem to be taking a lot of heart from President Trump's comments and keeping an eye toward the election. So that was certainly something that I saw reading through those transcripts that I thought was warranting some concern.
I know you can't predict the future, Hal, but just based off of what you know and what you've seen and people looking for answers to this, do you think that there is a reason for concern for violence in the future if this election, for whatever reason, doesn't go the way that President Trump wants it to go? Do you think that we have a reason to be concerned about right-wing hate groups and their propensity to interfere with the election or just begin this process of, again, confrontation and causing violence?
I keep hoping that that won't happen. You know, the Proud Boys had a rally that was heavily promoted just last Saturday in Portland, and not a lot happened. There was one or two incidences where people showed up at that rally and were not treated well. One man was kicked. But in terms of the large scale sort of violence that people were concerned about, it didn't happen. It was an hour-long rally. They noted that they picked up the trash in the park before they left, and they went back to drink beer and eat barbecue in Vancouver. And there was heavy coverage there. And yet it was a day that really was relatively calm by Portland standards. I certainly think that it's possible that after the election, things we could avoid sort of violence in the streets. But I'm just on guard. After the summer and just everything that's gone down, I'm just wary. I'm certainly hoping that's not the case.
My guest again, Hal Bernton, staff reporter for the Seattle Times. Got about 30, 45 seconds here, Hal. I just wanted to give you the opportunity for final words if there's something you want to share with our listeners.
Well, I really appreciate the chance to come on. This has been really hard time for me. And, Portland's a city that I've called home for more than 20 years. It's been a really difficult stretch. There already was a homeless crisis in the city, just as there is in Seattle. COVID hit, the protests. The city is having a tough year, and I'm like to think that as we all talk about 2020, that 2021 we can turn a quarter to a better time. And it would be great to see more dialogue between the left and the right, more opportunities where people could talk. We don't see that too much right now.
Thanks, Hal, and we may have to get you back on the air again, depending how things shake down here following this election.
Thank you.
You're listening to Tony B. It's me here on Rainier Avenue Radio. World. This is our coronavirus, impacts of the coronavirus on South Seattle and surrounding communities special. I was just talking to Hal Bernton from the Seattle Times about the potential for domestic terrorism and right-wing groups, Antifa, left-wing. We'll be back to talk a little bit more right after this.
This is Paul Pearson, host of Star Time. And when I'm not helping bad girls set up their websites, I'm listening to Rainier Avenue Radio.world.
Phil-Am Radio, servicing the Filipino and Filipino Americans all over the world. Phil-Am Radio, streaming live in the internet every Tuesday from 1 o'clock to 2:30 p.m. Seattle, USA time. We are your host, Kuya Bert Kawili, Emma Heron, and
Manny Panganiban.
Phil-Am Radio.
Wash your hands, don't touch your face, wipe things down, clean up your space. When you cough and sneeze, do responsibly. If you feel you're getting ill, isolate at home and chill. No, you're not alone. Please pick up your phone and call 206-477-3977. King County 206-477-3977. Public Health 206-477. 3977. King County 206-477-3977. Public community radio station will provide you with more information. Say Rainier Avenue Radio. Your community radio station will provide you with more information. Rainier Avenue Radio.
This is Karen Z with RainierAvenueRadio.world, and we want to hear from you. Our goal is to amplify and share the diverse voices of Southeast Seattle residents. Do you know of an engaged community member who should be featured in a community spotlight? Tell us about them. Do you know of an upcoming family-friendly, educational, or cultural event